Welcome to another edition of Architect Tomorrow. I'm really pleased to say that today we have Gunnar Menzel from Capgemini joining us to talk about architecture. This is one of the first of the series of interviews we're going to be doing, of sort of informal conversations with architects, well-known architects in the field, to kind of get an insight into what kind of really makes a good architect, what makes architects tick, what's the future of the profession. So, hence Architect Tomorrow, we're looking at what leading figures in the architecture community think is the future of architecture and architectures. So Gunnar, look, thanks very much for your time and for coming on. Perhaps we could start with just a bit of background on you.
Yeah. So Gunnar Menzel, I've been in the IT industry 32 years. I live in Manchester in the UK. I'm German, but in the UK since 1999. I work for Capgemini now since 2001. I'm currently the CTIO for Europe, so that's the Chief Technology Innovation Officer for Europe. But also one of the, I think we have 11 Master Certified Architects in group. So if you look at Capgemini, our architects community is roughly 8,000 people. So we have 8,000 architects across our organization. I have roughly 270,000 staff now in Capgemini globally. And I actually joined Capgemini in 2001 as an architect because I saw Capgemini as the leader in architecture per se, in terms of, when you look at Capgemini, for instance, we designed in 1996, I think was the first version when we released the Integrated Architecture Framework, IAF. That really kind of helped kind of structuring your thoughts in your approach in terms of architecture. So when I was a system engineer and I started to move more into kind of designing work, I looked at Capgemini, and that was when I ended up in Capgemini since 2001. Maybe also important maybe to know, over the last 15 years, so I come from a software development background. I used to write applications. I used to run big data centers, do infrastructure transformation, still claim to have a certain amount of knowledge on the technology side. But kind of the key roles that are really kind of occupied for the last 15 years now, so prior to my CTIO role in Europe, was what's called the account chief architect. So I was the lead architect for very large accounts that we have in Capgemini Group, usually take accountability for any solutions that we're delivering there from a technology, applications, or solution perspective.
Okay, and integrated architecture framework, that's what IAF stands for, right? It is really interesting. So perhaps talk to us a bit more about that. What's what is that kind of a high level, and is it kind of around this kind of theme that I see from quite a few different folks I talk to, which is around sort of trying to professionalize the architecture profession? Because if you think about it, if you're a building architect, you have to spend 7 years or whatever it is doing various degrees and qualifications. So is it kind of in that sort of linked in that sort of professionalization theme?
Maybe if I tell a story about how I came about seeing IAF. So this was 2001. I've been in the IT industry for just over 13 years at the time. So software development background, I knew Europe. It was the start of Agile at the time when we started to think about Agile development. And there was a point where, probably towards the end of the 1990s, I was working for Deutsche Bank at the time in Germany. And there was a point when a customer of mine came to me and he said, we need to implement the solution. Can you implement the solution for me? And typically, as an engineer, the first question that comes, or answer that springs to your mind is, by when do you need this? And then when I moved more, and that's when I realized I was actually an architect. So I didn't ask the question, when do you need this? I was asking the question, why do you need this? Mm-hmm. And I realized I actually wanted to understand context. I wanted to know, different options and really value for money. And you started kind of designing solutions, and you're thinking, well, if I need to be complete, if I need to be coherent, if I need to make sure that I cover the entire space of architecture, so business and data and infrastructure and applications and security and governance, there's a whole raft of things. Where do I start? What are kind of the artifacts that I actually have to create when I'm an architect? Where do I start? What do I do first? And this is where IAF as a content framework is really powerful. And it was developed by the architects, as I mentioned, in the 1990s. I think we started the first ideas of IAF came out in 94. First version came out in 96, I think. Okay. And the big idea was really kind of, like you said, it's not just professionalize, but formalize. So define the artifacts that you would usually deliver as
Mhm.
part of a solution, for instance, when you want to design an application or design an integration or design a new application environment. And this is what IAF really is kind of a content framework that includes all the various different artifacts that you need as an architect.
And that actually kind of leads me on to thinking about the qualities that make a good architect. Architecture, as we both know, is not easy, and there's a number of sort of trade-offs and balances to make, isn't there? And I think for me, one of the biggest ones is how do you, and you've touched on this already, how do you sort of trade off the knowledge of your industry versus the knowledge of the technology? But what do you think are the qualities that make a good architect, and perhaps where are they on that spectrum of sort of technology, IT technology versus technical versus sort of industry technical?
Yeah, pretty simple question. Not so easy to answer. I think you really kind of understand the context a bit better. I think
Yeah.
you need to kind of recognize and define a bit more what we mean actually by architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Then that in itself can be quite difficult to do.
The argument of architects, right?
Well, precisely. I mean, you have, when you look at architecture per se, I mean, IT architecture, it's actually quite interesting. I was doing a LinkedIn post, and a real architect replied to my LinkedIn post, says, "Could you please do me a favor? And when you refer to architecture, please say IT architecture," because they thought they were reading a blog by an architect talking about architecture. So I said, okay. So architects, you have different types of architecture, of course: enterprise, solution, security, technical, governance. So it's a whole raft of different architecture scope that you can work in. And then secondly, against this kind of framework, you could say, is you could also work in different stages. So you could be an architect that predominantly works in kind of, say, security, strategy and design phases.
Or the pre-sales phase if you're a consultant.
Or you're an architect who works mostly with your DevOps teams or Agile Scrum teams around development, and test and implementation. Or you're more the operational architect who looks after a running environment. So it's that kind of context you have to first kind of understand. And architecture, of course, when you look at the pure definition of IT architecture, it's all about managing complexity. Like I said, it's about reducing risk and reducing cost. And there are a number of course, conflicting aspects to that which you need to kind of balance, like you mentioned. And when you look at the market now, you have COVID-19, you have our clients having to respond very quickly. So speed and agility is really important, because that goes directly hand in glove with quality. No point of delivering something fast if it's not of good quality. You need to think about value for money. So whatever you do, it's not about being cheap. It's about value for money. It's making sure there's value behind these things. And then you have compliance, you have security, you have sustainability, you have the move from a very kind of service-based economy to a more purpose-based economy. Think about kind of diversity and sustainability and the shifting expectations in the market, but also in society. So it's a whole raft of things that you have to balance. And if you are an architect, say for instance you were an enterprise architect for a large client, and you've been tasked with maybe delivering the next blueprint for the next 5 years, or you are a solution architect, you're tasked with delivering a new CRM solution as a customer relationship management solution on a cloud-based platform. It's almost, I wouldn't say relevant, but there's almost no difference between or against the capabilities that you require. So there are typical 4 key kind of areas where you as an architect, I would say, need to excel. These are the things that you need to kind of combine to make sure that you are delivering something that has value for money, that delivers the functional requirements, meets the non-functional characteristics, is compliant, and so forth. And those 4 are, first, and this is kind of very obvious for IT architects, is IT knowledge. So knowing something around server, compute, and storage, knowing about networking, down to BGP, OSPF, thinking about routers and switches and protocols.
The OSI model, the different layers of that stack, right?
Having IT knowledge, so knowing the stuff, having the T-shirts. If you're in UK, this phrase. I've got the T-shirt, which means you have experience.
Yeah.
It's kind of the first, because if you're an architect and you design, even an enterprise architect, if you design solutions, not having appropriate technology or IT knowledge, it's going to be really tricky to making the right choices. I think secondly, and this is something that is, of course, most prevalent when you are solutioning or designing a solution as an architect, and I mean solutioning because solution can be different things. It could be the approach you're taking to finding an answer, or it could be the actual solution itself. So you have to have a certain level of design knowledge. So you need to be aware how to design solutions, how to design per se, how to work with stakeholders to make the right kind of decisions and so forth. So it's kind of the second could say skill or capability you require as an architect. Then you mentioned something before, which I think is the third one, and that's becoming more and more prevalent and more important, whereas technology skills and design skills was always there. If you were a server architect, you would design the server environment and you had server knowledge. So it's obvious it's been around for 30 years or so. But the third one gets more and more important. That's the sector knowledge. So having an insight into retail, so CPRD, how a retailer thinks, what basket size, what it means actually, the basket size statement. When you look at oil and gas industry, you know, how a platform works when they extract oil or gas out of a platform.
And I think it's more than just understanding the language, isn't it? Because I think that's one thing. It's kind of like understanding what perhaps your business stakeholders are talking about. It's also understanding what of those things are super relevant. You know, to your point around retail. You know, is it footfall? Is it, you know, kind of overhead cost? Is it, you know, kind of OPEX versus CAPEX? You know, what it's ultimately, what are the kind of business levers or drivers and pressures that are really important. So for me, it's kind of like there's two levels. The foundational level is just understanding what everyone is talking about, you know, particularly in like, you know, very technical disciplines like financial services. You know, front office is full of its own acronyms, you know, and various different, you know, bizarre terms like butterfly swap and spread and all these things. Understanding that is kind of foundational. Then it's actually that actually I think almost trying to get your head and empathizing with the business leadership and the strategy to think, where do we need to take this business to meet the trends that the sector is facing, right?
Quite. I mean, if you unpack that a bit, understanding sort of third kind of skill, the understanding of the sector is really important. I mean, we always have this discussion, sometimes this argument, what it actually means to understand. Does that mean you are a business analyst who has deep-seated sector knowledge around, you mentioned banking, retail banking or investment banking or in other sector, manufacturing, for instance?
Yep.
Of course not. You know, you're not a business analyst, you're not a business consultant, but the more you understand the sector, the better you can communicate. And we always talk about, you know, the architect being the connector between IT and technology.
The translator. Yeah.
So if you don't understand the business, it's going to be difficult to translate. Yeah, you need to have some kind of relationship. And I think more and more now, particularly with kind of the advent of agile, particularly when you think about the podification. So you have pods now of teams where you are accountable as a team, two pizza teams accountable for a particular service, say payment, for instance. You as an architect, you need to understand what does payment mean. So sector knowledge is really important. And the last thing, which is something I think which we're battling with for many years, and there's good reasons why, it is the consulting skills. It's being able to communicate, being able to influence directly or indirectly. It's being able to work with stakeholders, to communicate, to present.
It's listening as well, right? Which is this almost underplayed communication skill. Everyone thinks you need to be an extrovert and come across really well, but you need to use these twice as much as you use this.
Oh,
right?
Me too. I mean, I've been like I mentioned, you know, I'm proud of being in IT for 30 years, so I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud of still knowing BGP and OSPF. If you don't know what it is, it's a routing protocol basically. Or I'm still passionate about storage devices, you know, DS8700 on IBM or IT components or compute or Linux. I still could do on shell, of course, and that is an advantage, but also a disadvantage, because exactly the point you made, you then start taking over, and people then just disconnect and switch off. And you need
he thinks he knows all the answers. Yeah.
And that's a problem in the IT industry or the wider industry. Our perception. So when you look at our industry, if you say the IT architect industry or the community, what's the perception? If you ask a CFO, a COO, if you ask a business person, if you ask your family,
Yeah.
what do you think is an IT architect? A lot of them, I would say, maybe not so much anymore, but it used to be quite prevalent. A lot of them would say propeller heads. They would say, it's like you ask an architect and they talk for half a day, and then they draw you pictures you don't understand, and they all say it's really easy. So I think there's a bit of a difficulty there because we tend, I'm not saying we all do this, but we tend to communicate in very complex ways. Our job as an architect is to decomplexify. Our job is to make it easy to understand.
Great stuff. Thanks, Gunnar.
No problem, Olivia. Thank you.